Mako, Shade, and Blitz, three names whispered across California's darkest streets, not as men, but as legends of fear. They didn't just run a gang, they built an empire of silence, blood, and shadows. For over a decade, they stayed untouchable, hiding in plain sight while controlling everything from drug routes to assassinations. But when a forgotten USB drive resurfaced from a cold case, the truth began to unravel. This is the story of how California's most feared gang was finally exposed. In the sweltering heat of East Los Angeles, a gang was being born, not in a dramatic explosion, but in the slow, careful silence of desperation, violence, and ambition. It began on the cracked sidewalks of forgotten neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce and survival meant power. The streets were already home to graffiti, gunshots, and whispers of fear, but no one had yet imagined the scale of violence that was about to emerge. Among these streets, a name began circulating: the Crimson Jackals. The Crimson Jackals weren't always feared. At first, they were just another group of street kids stealing car radios and tagging alleys with red spray paint. But things changed the moment Miguel Reyes returned home. Miguel, known on the streets as Mako, had just finished a 7-year prison sentence for armed robbery and manslaughter. He had entered prison as a reckless young gangbanger, but he returned as a man with a plan. Mako was different. His stare was empty, his tone always calm. He spoke with conviction, calculated each move, and never allowed emotion to cloud his thinking. Mako saw the chaos of East LA not as a curse, but as an opportunity. He knew the drug trade, understood how guns moved, and recognized how power could be built, not through flashy violence but quiet, systemic fear. Within months of his return, Mako began recruiting. Not just anyone, he handpicked individuals who could serve a purpose. He needed a muscle, someone the streets feared. That role went to Luis Moreno, a 6'5" former underground fighter known as Blitz. Blitz was loyal to violence and nothing else. He didn't speak much, but when he moved, people cleared the path. His fists had shattered jaws and his stare had made grown men run. Then there was Tyrone Bell, better known as Shade. Shade had grown up in the same neighborhood as Mako, and he had the rare gift of blending into any crowd. He could handle weapons, drive anything with wheels, and vanish into the night without a trace. He became Mako's shadow, his strategist for the darker jobs, the clean-up, the threats, the disappearances. Together, this trio formed the core of the Crimson Jackals. But they didn't stop there. Mako's vision was bigger than turf wars. He began studying cartel operations and mimicked their structure. Leaders, lieutenants, runners, watchers, and cleaners. Everyone had a job. Discipline was non-negotiable. Betrayal meant death. Initiation was brutal. A prospective member had to complete a task without hesitation, usually involving a violent act that left no room for mercy. Those who passed earned the red jackal tattoo behind their ear, a symbol that you were no longer just a person, but property of something larger. What made the Jackals different was their silence. While other gangs boasted on social media, filmed their crimes, and started public feuds, the Crimson Jackals moved in shadows. They didn't broadcast power. They let others speak for them, through rumors and bodies. People who spoke against them went missing. Store owners who didn't pay protection had accidents. Even the police hesitated to cross them. No one had ever seen Mako lose his temper, and that made him more terrifying. His calm created an unpredictable energy, like a predator that waits silently before it strikes. By 2013, just 2 years after Mako's release from prison, the Jackals controlled major drug distribution points in Southern California. They weren't the biggest gang, but they were the most feared. They didn't engage in pointless gunfights. Instead, they used fear to keep people in line. Their drug empire grew quietly, stretching into Arizona and Nevada. They began laundering money through pawn shops, car dealerships, and even churches. Corrupt officials turned blind eyes in exchange for generous payments or simple threats. A few even joined the cause. Soon, young boys on the block weren't dreaming of becoming rappers or athletes. They were chasing the red jackal tattoo. The symbol became myth, seen as untouchable power. But with that growth came attention. Police began to notice patterns, names repeated in investigations. Witnesses refused to speak. Surveillance showed familiar faces at the scenes of unrelated crimes. Still, no charges stuck. The Jackals had lawyers, hackers, and insiders protecting every angle. In those early days, Mako established one rule that kept them untouchable: never act out of emotion. Every job was planned, every target selected with precision, and every move calculated. They weren't a street gang anymore. They had become a criminal empire, small, organized, deadly, and no one saw them coming. Not yet. In 2016, after years of silence, law enforcement finally thought they had a lead on the Crimson Jackals. A joint task force between LAPD and federal agents had been building a case slowly, carefully, always hitting dead ends. But everything changed during a drug raid in Boyle Heights. The raid was routine, aimed at a suspected stash house believed to belong to a local dealer. But what officers found inside shook them to the core. Floor to ceiling stacks of cocaine, military-grade weapons, and documents stamped with the Crimson Jackal symbol. Even more valuable, 2 men were arrested on site: Rico Mendez and Victor Gomez. Rico and Victor weren't just runners. They were mid-level operators, trusted enough to know routes, suppliers, drop points, and possibly more. At first, they refused to speak, hardened by fear of retaliation. But within days, facing heavy federal charges and with promises of witness protection, they agreed to testify. It was the first time in over 5 years that any known member of the Jackals had even considered talking. The LAPD moved fast. Both men were placed into a secure location, a private safe house under federal watch. Only a small circle knew where they were: a few high-ranking officers, 2 federal prosecutors, and the assigned task force team. It seemed like the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. Plans were already being made for a grand jury hearing. Investigators hoped this would finally lead them to Mako, Shade, Blitz, and perhaps dozens of others. But within 48 hours, everything unraveled. When federal agents arrived to transport the 2 witnesses for a private briefing, the house was empty. No broken locks, no signs of struggle. Just 2 empty chairs and untouched meals still sitting on the kitchen counter. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras had been wiped clean. The 2 officers assigned to guard the location were gone. Both later found dead in a burned-out van on the outskirts of the city. Panic spread quickly through law enforcement. Internal investigations began immediately. How had the Jackals known where the witnesses were? How had they gotten past 2 federal agents without a trace? Was there a leak within the task force? More questions than answers swirled, and fear started spreading even among the most experienced officers. Then came the message. Just 2 days after the disappearance, an unmarked package arrived at LAPD headquarters. Inside was a flash drive. It contained a 30-second video, grainy and without sound. It showed Rico and Victor kneeling in a dark room, visibly terrified. Behind them stood a masked man pointing a gun. The video cut out before the trigger was pulled, but the message was crystal clear: no one betrays the Crimson Jackals. The video was never released to the public, but the story spread quickly. News outlets picked up fragments of the case, spinning them into rumors. Conspiracy theories flooded the internet. Some believed the witnesses had never existed. Others claimed they were taken to Mexico and forced into the cartel system. A few even believed the FBI had orchestrated their disappearance to cover something up, but the reality was far darker. The Jackals had infiltrated law enforcement at a level no one had imagined. That same month, a seasoned crime journalist named Allison Kemp published a bold article titled "The Red Fog: How the Crimson Jackals Control Los Angeles." She was the first reporter to publicly link several unsolved murders, drug operations, and police failures directly to the Jackals. She accused local politicians of accepting bribes, hinted that key detectives were compromised, and warned that the gang's influence was spreading faster than anyone realized. 3 weeks later, Allison disappeared. Her car was discovered in the Mojave Desert, completely torched, with no signs of human remains. Her laptop and phone were never recovered. She had no history of depression, no known threats on record. Her disappearance was added to a growing list of missing persons possibly tied to the gang. At this point, the Crimson Jackals were no longer seen as just another violent crew. They were something more, a ghost operation capable of reaching anyone, anywhere. Detectives stopped talking to reporters. Prosecutors refused to take on related cases without overwhelming evidence. Even some seasoned agents transferred departments, not wanting to risk their families. Fear had become the gang's greatest weapon. Not bullets, not money, just silence. While other criminal groups fought turf wars in the open, the Jackals remained invisible, moving like a shadow through the legal system, media, and city streets. The vanishing of Rico, Victor, and Allison marked a turning point. People began to understand the Crimson Jackals weren't just criminals. They were untouchable, and no one was safe, not even those trying to stop them. In early 2018, the Crimson Jackals made their first and only mistake. It wasn't a grand blunder or a bloody shootout. It was a quiet transaction gone slightly wrong. During a rainy February night in a warehouse on the edge of Riverside, a shipment of illegal firearms arrived late. The buyers were getting anxious. In the chaos of the exchange, law enforcement received a tip from an anonymous source. When the tactical team moved in, most of the suspects escaped through a network of tunnels beneath the property. But one man didn't. Danny Ortega, known in the streets as Whip, was arrested while trying to flee. He was a lower-tier member of the Crimson Jackals, someone who delivered messages, moved small packages, and cleaned up crime scenes. To most officers, he wasn't worth much. But Danny had something they didn't expect: information. Not just about petty street crimes, but about the deeper workings of the Jackals' criminal empire. At first, Danny said nothing. He stared at the walls, refused food, and ignored every question. Days passed with no progress, until a tech expert combing through his seized laptop found something strange. Hidden deep within an encrypted folder were files, dozens of them, containing everything from bank transactions and supply routes to names, coded addresses, and images. Danny hadn't just been a runner, he had been documenting the operations in secret. No one knew why. Maybe it was insurance. Maybe he planned to sell it. But whatever the reason, the files gave investigators a rare glimpse into the machine behind the Jackals. With the evidence in hand, the FBI launched Operation Black Veil, a covert mission aimed at dismantling the gang from within. The goal was simple: gather enough proof to bring down the leadership without alerting them. Over the next year, federal agents worked quietly, building new identities, tracking transactions, and monitoring communications. Every piece of information led to another. Safe houses were discovered. Weapons caches were located. Bank accounts were frozen. Slowly, the web began to unravel. One discovery changed everything. Among the data was a location mentioned multiple times: an abandoned shipping warehouse in Compton. The building had no registered owner, and utilities had been disconnected for years. But satellite images revealed movement. Cars entered and left at odd hours. Deliveries were made at night. Drones captured blurry footage of armed men patrolling the area. It was clear this was no ordinary hideout. This was the command center. In November 2019, the FBI made their move. With the help of local SWAT teams and federal marshals, they raided the warehouse in the early morning hours. The operation was surgical. Agents breached the doors from 3 sides, securing every exit. But when they entered, they found something more disturbing than they had imagined. Inside were dozens of rooms, some hidden behind false walls and trapdoors. There were rooms used for torture, soundproof chambers with chains and bloodstains. They found a room filled with IDs, passports, and wigs, proof of the gang's ability to vanish at will. They uncovered ledgers detailing shipments of drugs, weapons, and even human trafficking. But the most chilling discovery was the kill list. On the wall, written in red ink, was a list of names: police officers, lawyers, journalists, and politicians. Some names had checkmarks next to them. Others were circled. All were real people, many of whom had died under suspicious circumstances. The Jackals hadn't just eliminated enemies, they had planned it with methodical precision. But the 3 people the FBI wanted most, Mako, Shade, and Blitz, were not there. The warehouse had been cleared out only hours before the raid. Surveillance footage had been destroyed, and the hard drives in the building were melted in acid. The entire place had been scrubbed, cleaned just enough to leave no fingerprints behind. Agents knew immediately what had happened. Someone had tipped them off. Operation Black Veil had been compromised. Months of work had ended in an empty building, blood-stained walls, and missing targets. There was no confrontation, no shootout, only a chilling realization. The Jackals were always one step ahead. Despite the setback, the raid gave law enforcement something new: fearlessness. Now, they had seen behind the curtain. They had touched the edge of the empire. And even though their targets had slipped away, the silence that had once protected the Jackals was starting to crack. People were talking. New leads were forming. And while the top of the pyramid had vanished, the foundation had been exposed. The hunt wasn't over. It had just begun. As 2020 began, a storm was quietly building within federal law enforcement. The failed raid on the Crimson Jackals, headquarters in Compton, had left more questions than answers. How had they known about the operation? Why were all surveillance systems neutralized so efficiently? Who had destroyed the evidence so quickly? These questions haunted the task force assigned to Operation Black Veil, and every possible answer pointed to one terrifying conclusion. There was a traitor on the inside. Whispers started circulating within the agencies involved. Files went missing, agents reported being followed, and digital forensics teams began noticing breaches in classified databases. Someone had been feeding the Jackals detailed intelligence. Plans, names, timelines, and most disturbingly, the location of witnesses and informants. The mole wasn't some careless leaker. Whoever it was had high-level clearance and understood every angle of the operation. In March of that year, a cybersecurity analyst working for the FBI found something unusual in a server backup. It was a single encrypted file that didn't match any known classification or user log. When decrypted, it revealed a chilling list of dates, operations, and internal memos, all previously restricted to senior-level staff. The breach was deep. It had been going on for nearly 8 months, and every major decision made by the task force had likely been shared with the Crimson Jackals in real time. Through careful tracing, the breach was finally linked to one name: Elias Grant, an undercover intelligence operative embedded in the tech team that supported Operation Black Veil. Elias had been hired for his expertise in encryption and digital forensics. He had a spotless record, years of federal work, and glowing recommendations from multiple agencies. No one had suspected him. But now, all signs pointed to Grant not just being involved, but being the mole the Jackals had relied on for nearly a year. Agents tracked Elias to a remote safe house in San Bernardino County. But when they arrived, he was already gone. His car was found abandoned at a gas station near the border. Cameras showed him boarding a private charter plane from a rural airstrip hours before agents closed in. The pilot was later found dead in a motel, and the aircraft had disappeared off radar over the Sea of Cortez. In his abandoned laptop, agents found a final message, a file labeled Ghost, which was also Elias Grant's codename while operating within the Jackals network. The message contained a confession. Grant admitted to working with the Crimson Jackals, claiming he was blackmailed after they discovered his family's whereabouts. He described a meeting with Blitz, who had presented him with photos of his wife and son walking home from school. The threat was clear: cooperate, or they die. In the file, Grant detailed how he created backdoor access into FBI systems, routed communications through untraceable servers, and destroyed evidence that could incriminate key Jackal leaders. He expressed regret but insisted he had no choice. His final sentence read, "They never needed to fire a gun. They just needed to know who I loved." The manhunt for Elias Grant stretched into the summer. Anonymous tips came in from Texas, New Mexico, and even Belize, but none were confirmed. Most investigators believed he was dead, executed by the same gang he had helped. Others believed he vanished under a new identity, just like so many Jackals had done before. The betrayal cut deep. Trust within law enforcement was fractured. Entire teams were reshuffled, operations delayed, and protocols rewritten. Every active investigation connected to the Crimson Jackals was paused and reviewed. Dozens of officers and analysts were subjected to internal audits. Morale sank as agents realized how thoroughly the gang had infiltrated the system. But the damage wasn't just emotional. Grant's betrayal allowed the Jackals to shut down over 30 shell companies, erase digital trails, and relocate key members to different states and even countries. Mako, Shade, and Blitz were gone again, ghosts in the wind. Surveillance attempts failed, informants dried up, and the public began to forget. With no new leads and no concrete evidence, prosecutors had to quietly drop several cases. Despite the chaos, the task force refused to give up. A new team was assembled, smaller and more secretive. They operated under strict silence, using handwritten communication and burner phones, avoiding digital records entirely. They believed that even though the Jackals had disappeared, the cracks in their empire were showing. Money was slowing. Operations were messier. The myth was still alive, but the machine was beginning to break. The Crimson Jackals had survived because of silence, precision, and fear. But now, a pattern was forming. The leadership was running out of places to hide. And for the first time, law enforcement wasn't looking for gangsters. They were hunting ghosts. By late 2023, the Crimson Jackals had become more legend than reality. For over a decade, they had moved in the shadows, controlling drug routes, silencing witnesses, and escaping every attempt to bring them down. Law enforcement had faced dead ends, betrayal, and fear. But a discovery in a cold case reopened a door that many believed had been permanently closed. A detective reviewing the unsolved disappearance of journalist Allison Kemp came across a box of old evidence overlooked for years. Inside, it was a USB drive, heavily damaged but still intact. Forensic technicians worked for weeks to recover the data. What they found would reignite the hunt for the Crimson Jackals. The drive contained a folder titled Red Dust, and inside were photos, lists of names, bank account details, and surveillance images. Every piece pointed directly to the top of the organization: Mako, Shade, and Blitz. It was clear that Allison had come closer to the truth than anyone had imagined. The photos were the most shocking. One showed Mako wearing sunglasses and a white blazer, laughing on the deck of a luxury yacht in San Diego. Another captured Blitz entering a gym in Phoenix, where he worked as a personal trainer under the alias Victor Lane. Shade was seen walking into a high-end security firm in Beverly Hills, his identity concealed behind layers of false paperwork and forged credentials. They hadn't gone underground. They had gone professional. Instead of hiding, the leaders of the Crimson Jackals had carefully rebuilt themselves in plain sight. With fake names, clean records, and carefully managed appearances, they operated legitimate businesses while keeping their criminal ties hidden. The gang itself had splintered into smaller cells, each operating independently, sending portions of their profits back to the top. The organization no longer looked like a street gang. It resembled a corporation. With this information in hand, federal authorities launched a final coordinated strike. Surveillance teams were assigned to track each target, monitoring their routines, connections, and movements. It was clear that each man had become comfortable in his new life, believing the danger had passed. This overconfidence would be their downfall. In January 2024, Blitz was the first to fall. Agents moved in as he finished his morning shift at the gym. Caught off guard, he was arrested without resistance. His identity was confirmed through fingerprint analysis. The arrest shocked the local community, where Blitz had built a reputation as a kind and disciplined trainer. But behind the smile and workout plans was a man responsible for more than a dozen murders. Days later, Shade was apprehended outside his firm during a routine lunch break. He attempted to flee but was caught blocks away. His laptop contained files referencing encrypted messages, suggesting he was still coordinating activities for the gang. While being transported, he refused to speak, staying true to the silent code the Jackals had lived by for years. Mako, however, remained elusive. He had sold his yacht business weeks before the arrests and disappeared. For months, agents followed weak leads across California, Nevada, and Mexico. Just when it seemed he might escape justice once again, a drone surveillance unit picked up activity on a remote island off Baja California. Satellite images revealed a private town surrounded by guards. A joint task force organized a nighttime raid. There was no warning, no negotiation. When it ended, Mako was found dead in his quarters, the result of a single gunshot wound. Fingerprints confirmed his identity. The man who had built California's most feared gang died alone, surrounded by luxury bought with blood. With their leaders gone, the Crimson Jackals fell silent. Remaining cells scattered or disappeared entirely. Though investigations continue, the empire they built is crumbling. The myth has faded, replaced by court records and prison sentences. The Crimson Jackals were finally exposed. Not with a headline, but with a quiet end to a decade of terror. Their shadow still lingers, but their power has broken. For the first time, California breathes a little easier.